In the world today, there are a lot of people who make their suffering, their problems, a part of their personality. And the title of today's stream, or this lecture, is Your Problems Aren't Your Personality. I think this is a really great example of how, like, there's a disconnect between, some of our content team and what I'm about to say. Because what we're going to talk about today is how some people's problems become their personality. So I know the title is like Your Problems Aren't Your Personality, but actually the really crazy thing, so if you look at the science of the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, what you discover is there is like a personality construct that is the tendency for interpersonal victimhood. So actually the really crazy thing is that it is a normal human mechanism to turn your problems into your personality. And I think this tweet is really great because it says, we've become too articulate about our suffering and too inarticulate about our strength. The more elegantly we describe our wounds, the harder it becomes to leave them behind. When a struggle becomes part of your identity, overcoming it feels like a betrayal of who you are. And I would wholeheartedly agree with this tweet. And not only do I wholeheartedly agree with it, we're going to show you all some fascinating research about how and why this happens, okay? So the first bit of research that I'm going to talk to you all about is not something I'm going to show you all a paper about, because sometimes in med school, you just learn these things and they get banked away. So I remember learning about a really interesting study where they measured pain scores in the ICU. So basically a nurse comes in every hour and asks you, how's your pain? And the more times that someone asks you how your pain is, the more pain you actually feel, right? So I remember walking away from this study sort of thinking, or learning this in med school and sort of thinking, realizing, okay, when you continually ask someone how's your nausea, how's your nausea, how's your nausea, how's your nausea, the more time that a patient's mind spends on an issue, the worse that issue gets. So there are multiple studies that show that ruminating about the negative things in your life actually exacerbate whatever you're ruminating about, right? So the more time that I spend thinking about something, the worse that thing becomes. And the most counterintuitive example of this is why people who go through traumatic experiences are not traumatized. One of the hardest things that I learned as a psychiatrist is that many people who go through a traumatic experience just kind of leave it behind them and don't need to process it much. I know it sounds really insane, but the most confusing thing for many people, for example, who are sexual assault survivors, is how little it bothers them. I'm not saying that it's okay to do or things like that. I'm saying that there's actually a bunch of research that shows that 50% or more of people, I'm a bit rusty on the numbers, when they go through a negative experience, will sort of have some period of negativity around it, and then they'll actually be okay. But if we sort of look at it, right, bad stuff happens to people all the time. But as we become more focused on it, as we become ruminating on it, as it becomes a part of, as we spend more time on it, it does actually become a part of our identity. And once it becomes a part of identity, then something really scary happens, because now that this suffering becomes a part of my identity, this is who I am, so I can't let go of that suffering. And this is actually exactly what happens. The really weird thing is that suffering turning into my identity is actually a completely normal and arguably even healthy thing, okay? So this is an article on the journey of sense-making and identity construction in the aftermath of trauma. So peer support as a vehicle of co-construction. So this paper is specifically looking at a study of peer support and people sort of getting together and talking about the experience of their trauma. And when they talk about it together, they develop a sense of identity. And this is a key thing. We talk about this a lot in Dr. K's Guide to Trauma, about how if you look at trauma, what trauma does is it shakes your sense of identity, right? I used to be this kind of person, and then I get traumatized, and now I don't know who I am. So there is a systematic process of reconstructing your identity in a healthy way that we lay out in Dr. K's Guide to Trauma, okay? So this can be a healthy part of trauma recovery. The problem is that sometimes when we experience a traumatic event, if we don't steer that narrative identity construction in the right way, the identity that we are left with is as someone who has been traumatized. I've been screwed in life. I haven't dated anyone in high school or college. Therefore, I am destined to be alone, right? I'm someone who is lazy. I'm fundamentally lazy and undisciplined. I had this failure, I had this failure, I had this failure, and now I am a loser. These negative experiences solidify into a negative sense of identity.
Hey y'all, if you're interested in applying some of the principles that we share to actually create change in your life, check out Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health.
So this is a guide that explores this process. How does experience shape us as human beings? Trauma is all about walling off or suppressing things that are overwhelming. They cannot control their emotions, so their emotions control them.
So check out the link in the bio and start your journey today.
Now, here's what this kind of practically looks like, okay? Or why this becomes a real problem, okay? I like this because when we kind of go back to this, when a struggle becomes a part of your identity, overcoming it feels like a betrayal of who you are, right? So I wouldn't necessarily use the word betrayal, but I think that when I work with patients who have developed an identity of victimhood, which if we sort of look at this, victimhood is an identity. In the present research, we introduce a conceptualization of the tendency for interpersonal victimhood, which we define as an enduring feeling that the self is a victim across different kinds of interpersonal relationships. So the findings highlight the importance of understanding, conceptualizing, and empirically testing TIV and suggest that victimhood is a stable and meaningful personality tendency. Okay, so here's what this practically looks like. Some people develop an identity based around their suffering. Now, here's the big problem with that. Once you develop an identity as a victim, what this study shows and other studies that sort of explore it will show is that once I am a victim, no matter where I go, that is who I am. Right? So like you may have encountered some of these people in life. You could be one of these people in life where like they're a victim like at Thanksgiving, they're a victim at their job. And it's really fascinating because once you tunnel down into the research of this, there are particular things that happen to these people. So they are particularly like raw in terms of interpersonal interactions. They see themselves as the victim in interpersonal interactions. And then the bigger problem is that once this becomes part of your identity, once you have a traumatic formation of a maladaptive identity, then it becomes really hard to let go of. Okay, so I'll give you all an example. I was working with someone who was in their mid-30s who had something called double depression. So when we look at depression, this is multiple clinical entities. Okay, so one is something called major depressive disorder. Okay, this is where there are episodic periods. So there are episodes of persistently low mood, anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure, low energy, low motivation, sometimes suicidal thinking, impaired sleep, all this kind of stuff. The key thing about major depressive disorder is that it's episodic. It comes and goes. So the longest it tends to last is about 12 months. The other interesting thing about MDD is that it tends to resolve. So MDD is when you have like a period of time, maybe like up to a year, where you had like a really crappy year that was hard for you. It can be triggered by life circumstances like losing your job or losing a loved one or a breakup or something like that. But then the way we know someone has MDD, and this all we explain in Dr. K's Guide to Depression, the way that you know if you have MDD, or the way that a clinician tells is that it knows is that, let's say you have a breakup, and we would expect after a breakup you're sad for a certain amount of time, okay? But if the sadness is persistent beyond the breakup, what we would expect for the breakup period, right? So after you get fired from a job, you're really sad, you're bummed out, you apply for other jobs, right? You pull yourself out of it, you apply for other jobs, you find another job. But even when you go into work, you're incredibly like unmotivated, very low energy. Even though you have fixed the problem, the symptoms persist. This is how we separate out an appropriate negative reaction. So in the Guide to Depression, I talk about these as congruent depression from a persistent clinical episode, which lasts beyond the stressor. Okay. But then there's another kind of depression called dysthymia. So this is the clinical construct behind this is like kind of variable. It's an older concept from psychiatry that we've sort of turned into something else. But I like this concept of dysthymia. So dysthymia is a persistent depressive state that is usually not as severe as major depressive disorder. So you're kind of sad for like 15 years at a stretch. And some really unlucky people have both. So I'm persistently sad for a very long time, and I have episodes of depression layered on top. When I work with people who are persistently sad, there's a really, really tricky element of treatment, which is that the dysthymia becomes the explanation for so many things in their life, right? If I am persistently depressed, that explains why I haven't had a successful career. That explains why I don't have successful relationships. That explains my obesity, right? And this is the really tricky thing. I don't want to use the word excuse because excuse implies that it's not the real cause, right? So when I say like, oh, this is an excuse, that's not really the reason. So the really tough thing about this is that this is real. Your persistent depression is a very real contributor to your lack of professional success, your lack of relationship success, your lack of, physical health and wellness, whatever. It is a very real cause. There are tons of studies that show that depression leads to bad outcomes. But the problem is once it becomes your identity, once you have a reason why you are a failure in life, that reason becomes really hard to let go of. Because if you get rid of that reason, then why are you a failure in your life? You can no longer blame the depression. You have to accept responsibility yourself, okay? And I see this like in this patient. Other examples of this, when I seen it in its most toxic forms, is actually with parents. So parents who are like narcissistic and things like that, like, once they have this idea of being a victim and like they have all of these challenges and like I went through a lot of trauma. So I've seen like, parents with borderline personality disorder who were abused growing up and they were a victim. And once they become a victim, right? So that then like if you have something like borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder, then what happens is like you have a reason, right? Why you have a good reason to screw up. You have a good reason to yell at your kids. You have a good reason if you've got BPD and you're ill and you've gone through so much trauma and you have difficulty regulating your affect, you've kind of got like a very reasonable, like real reason why you are not a great parent. And the problem is as we start to treat this, the real problem is that the BPD does not explain all of you being mad at your kids. They don't explain every part of the explosiveness. They don't explain the persistent depressive disorder does not explain every one of your failures, right? It makes everything 50% harder, but there is some degree of personal responsibility somewhere in there. And that becomes really hard to let go of, right? And this is what's really scary is our brain, our mind, when we have a good reason for failure, it sort of shields us from our own responsibility. And so the hard work that I oftentimes have to do, and this is not easy to do, right? It's not as simple as like, because then it's like the hard work that I have to do is like, okay, how much are you responsible, right? What percentage of this is your fault and what percentage of it isn't your fault? That's a really hard thing to tunnel down into. The other reason that this becomes really hard to let go of is constructing a hero-victim identity through reminiscing, a phenomenological study on rural Chinese elders, okay? So this is a super cool study that's looking at older people from China who went through some bad stuff. And the really interesting thing about this is these people were many times victims. But what they sort of talk about is like how the idea of being a victim actually connects with the idea of being a hero. Okay. And I want to show you guys like what this means. So here's the really weird thing about being a victim. If we look at psychology, basic psychology, being a victim actually makes you a hero. It's kind of weird, right? So think about it, right? So there's like breast cancer. I get diagnosed with breast cancer. Now I'm a victim, right? This is not my fault. So when we define victim, and the paper does a good job of this, like a victim is someone who something bad happens to you and it isn't your fault. Now, once I get diagnosed with breast cancer, that also opens the door to being a hero. That opens the door to being a breast cancer survivor, right? So being traumatized is bad. I'm a trauma victim. I'm a victim of trauma, but then I'm also a trauma survivor. And this is like healthy and adaptive. So part of that process, part of that healthy process is like reconstructing your identity in a healthy way. To view yourself not as a victim, but as someone who is triumphant. This is where things get really tricky psychologically, right? Because unless you do this in the right way, your heroism is rooted in your victimness. So I don't know if y'all have seen people like this, right? So we call this colloquially a martyr complex. What is a martyr complex? It is the tying of heroism to being a victim. I am persecuted, but what is a martyr? A martyr is someone who suffers and is a hero. It is the tying of a heroic identity to being a victim. And now if you do this, now you're in huge trouble because the triumphant part of you, the heroic part of you, imagine you have persistent depressive disorder and every day is sad. But you know what? You are someone who's still here. And your value is not from your career, not from your relationships, not from what you've accomplished in your life, but your heroism comes from your resilience in the face of depression. That becomes the most positive part of your identity, is that you're a hero because you're a survivor. And if that becomes the core part of your identity, if your claim to self-esteem is that you are a survivor, as you go into the workplace, we end up with this, right? We end up with everywhere I go, I become a victim. Because every time I'm a victim, I'm a hero. And when I go to work, I want to be a hero. When I go to work, I need to be a hero because instead of actually doing the job and excelling in work performance, what I'm going to do is adopt this victim-hero complex. And this is the key thing that a lot of us miss, right? Because we see the victim, they cry the victim, they say they're the victim, and sometimes they are the victim. I'm not saying like don't believe victims. But there is an insidious part of this where like our positive identity comes out of that, which is why we can do a study that demonstrates that there is a personality construct of victimhood. So how do we get over this? It's hard, right? I think a big part of this is encouraging personal responsibility. A big part of this is when I work with these kinds of people, you know, what I try to do is, I don't know if this makes sense, an idea of positive identity as a hero-victim construct is one of the worst ways to feel good about yourself, right? It becomes a really easy way to feel good about yourself, but you don't feel good about yourself because of your actual accomplishments. That feels so much better. And so a big part of this is in asking yourself, okay, where is my personal responsibility? Now that question becomes really painful because that means it's not somebody else's fault. That means that it's your fault. But then that also opens the door. If it is my fault, then I can do something about it. And then I can improve in that dimension. I actually have some degree of control in that dimension. And then once I exercise that control, once I start making the right decisions, once I start doing things that I can actually be proud of, aside from being a victim hero, then my self-esteem is solved, right? And that's what we want to do. When we talk about positive narrative identity construction, so in the trauma guide, we rewire your physiology, change your brain, change your mind, and then construct an identity, construct a healthy identity. And that healthy identity is some of this isn't my fault. Some of this stuff is. And the moment we do that, we become empowered to change our lives instead of being a victim.